you're going to say, this is the Estes Park Group, what date is today, and we're having this author thing, and here's what they're going to talk about. And then you choose the batting order here. Okay?
Okay. All right.
Wait, three.
Oh yeah, and I started it just now.
Wait. 3, 2, 1, go.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining the Estes Park Group. Today, we're going to have a book chat. We're privileged to have a number of guests who have written books in and around data-centric architecture, knowledge graphs, query languages, and the like, ontologies, etc. So it's a good opportunity to get these folks' insights. They've been really at the forefront of what we're trying to do with raising awareness about our group and what the value of what we're doing is. So I'm going to start with the most recently published authors, Ora and Juan. And Ora is at AWS. He's what's your title there, Ora?
My title is Principal Technologist, and I'm a member of the NEP2 graph database team.
Yeah, and before that, you were at State Street.
Well, I was at State Street doing ontologies, but a lot of the work that I've done when I was at Nokia, where I spent 7 years of my life. And as an author, I guess maybe I should mention that 20 years ago, I wrote co-authored a little article.
Yeah.
In Scientific American.
Okay. And then Juan is your co-author, and Juan, many people know you, PhD from UT Austin. You probably know Yingding really well. And you had your own company, Capsenta, and you had the product Grapho that's now featured at data.world, where you have the role of...
I'm the principal scientist at data.world.
Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if I can find out how to do it. But Ora and Juan, you've written a book that I haven't read yet called Designing and Building Enterprise Knowledge Graphs. So what was the motive behind the book? What got you angry enough to write a book about this?
That people are dumping data into a graph database and calling it a knowledge graph and not knowing how to go do things from a systematic way. By the way, I'm hearing a lot of echo. I don't know.
Let me mute myself here.
If I may, I think the echo is because we don't have headsets, so the sound from the computer loop back. So if everyone mute and we... Doesn't make sense.
I guess echo's gone now, I hear. But so yeah, it was basically that is that we think about dumping data into a graph, and we don't think about how to go model it and how to go map it. And the big portion of this book is about mappings. And I think this is something that we don't really think about, and we need to have a systematic way to be able to think about, hey, here's the stuff that we have in the source, and we got to, how do we put it into the target? So a big part of the book is, I think, like 25 different mapping patterns that we've just kind of established and realized over years and years of doing this in practice. And then I started, a lot of this is building up from papers and my own work. And then Ora and I started talking, I don't know, almost like 2 years ago. And I mean, I told Ora one day, like, yeah, I'm stressed out because I don't have time. I've been working on this book for a year. And then it kind of hit me right there. It's like, Ora, we should do this together. And he's like, yeah. And then the pandemic, and this was during the pandemic and silver linings of the pandemic. Well, you get more, you're not on planes, you're not traveling. So we got more time to go do this. So I'll pass it on to Ora.
Yeah, and I think I'm not entirely sure if we were angry to write this book, but maybe frustrated. I mean, for me, it was for many years building things, bringing legacy data or something like that, and building graphs out of those. People kept asking me, well, what about the semantics of the legacy data? And I'm always like, well, you sometimes you build that semantics into the ETL process, and in this case, we talk about the mappings, and you can build your knowledge of the semantic, the legacy data into the means. So I think we had fun writing book, and we had to really, well, I mean, we do make some critical statements about modern data practice in that book, and I think those statements are all justified. There has been, well, in many ways, we are still suffering things that existed a time ago, and it's like there has no substantial change in how we deal with data. And I hear these words about data from a lot of people all the time. So it's our contribution to try to help the whole industry.
And one comment is, and we actually wrote we put a disclaimer. So this is an opinionated book, and this is based on our experiences. So, and then in the disclaimer, this is about relational databases, how to building knowledge graph from relational databases. We actually wanted to put that in the title to make it very specific, but it wouldn't even fit on the cover. So that's why we put a disclaimer there.
We're not saying that you can't take data from other sources. It's just that we focus on that because that's a big part of modern data practice.
Yeah, I look at the popularity rankings and I see relational databases still have like 95%, and maybe NoSQL has 5% of the popularity. So they're not going away. And so what's the bridge that you've been able to build between the semantics concepts and the relational incumbency that we work with?
I think before we get into the bridge, we should notice that, or we should note that in some ways, there are a lot of people who may have a hard time thinking outside the realm of relational databases. And I think this hampers some of this adoption of these other technologies, such as knowledge graphs, for example. We put a quote in the book from Wittgenstein that says, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world," and this is something over the years that I found to be true in many different contexts. In this case, of course, the language we're talking about is the relational model, the relational database way of doing this. So people who have relational database for many years, it may be difficult for people to understand there is the world outside the relational basis. There are different ways of doing things.
And to add to that is, the goal of this book is not to really educate, no, you should be using graphs for this, and that's why it's better. Actually, in the preface, we explicitly wrote, we think that if you're reading this book, you already want to leverage graph technologies. If in your mind, the question of relational versus graph is still at the forefront, you may not be ready for this book. Don't be one of those people. So this is us being opinionated and being bold. If you're still thinking, no, can't I do this in relational? You're a follower and you're not a leader. This book is for leaders.
Yeah, so I just read this book yesterday. I mean, I only got it a few days ago, so it's fresh in my mind. And like you're saying, Juan, in the front, you make these, you make these claims. We can make things a lot simpler and stuff. And then toward the back, when you have this e-commerce use case, whose name I won't reveal, but it sure sounds familiar. But here's the problem we've been struggling with for a long time. Maybe you guys got deeper into this. So they had several thousand tables just to do their ordering system, and you said, well, we really only need these 4. At some point, we have to figure out how to tell the relational people what were the other 2,490 tables there for? I mean, they're not there for nothing, but they're not really contributing a lot either. And did you ever get into that?
I think an option we should make is that relational models and relational schema is not for humans. So there's a lot of in a relational schema that definitely is not for humans. and most, I would say, any non-trivial relational schema is completely unintelligible to humans. And I think that once you kind of get through that stuff that isn't meant for humans, and you get to the essence of the model, there isn't that much anymore necessarily.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. Thanks for raising the issue, Dave. And I thought it was, Aura, you had a really good reaction to it. I'm wondering what Michael thinks about this topic. You know, we're all in this situation where we're trying to raise visibility about data modeling generally and its importance, and how to make it more user-friendly, how to do data management that also includes some knowledge management principles, for example. So maybe Michael and Heather would have some comments about that. Michael, your book is Demystifying OWL for the Enterprise, correct? Still on mute right now.
Mute.
Of course I am. I always am. Anyway, thank you, Alan, for pulling this together and inviting me to participate. Yeah, so my thoughts on kind of following on what Dave had said a moment ago. We've had a lot of experience over the years building ontologies and then converting the relational data into knowledge graphs. Thank you. And we noticed time and time again, as Dave said, you know, we haven't noticed 2,400 down to 4, but we usually find a 10-fold or 50-fold reduction in complexity. And it's just kind of fascinating. One of the principles that we've operated by is to first talk to the people and understand what the subject matter is about, and not really look at the database itself. And then once we understand the subject matter, we model it out. Then we look at the data to make sure we have it covered. And so we've found that's very useful. And we've always done our modeling and all. Coming back to my book and why I wrote it. So we've got a lot of OWL experience in-house, and in my case, 10 years of building enterprise models for large companies. And really, I felt there was a need for this book because although there's a great book by Alamang and Handler and now Gandon, which is all about the semantic web. It's much more comprehensive than mine, but it only dips into OWL a little bit. It's not trying to address OWL. And so the purpose of this book for the audience really is people who have already decided, I want to learn about OWL. What's it all about? But to come at it not from a completely non-academic perspective. It's like, I just want people to not have to have any background in logic, but really just to be able to think logically. And the other thing I emphasized was, because what you often get is, here's this construct, and then here's this other construct, and here's this other construct, and here's this other construct. And it's fine as a reference book, but I wanted something that was going to be more readable. And so what I did was I just started with an example and said, here's what we're talking about when we talk about ontologies, very general, broad, sweeping view. And then get into the details of what you can do with the OWL language, but never to introduce any construct on its own and say, here's a construct, isn't it cool? But only introduce a construct as the response to a need from an example that I'm already talking about. So that was kind of the first part of the book, just a general introduction. And then the third chapter in the first part of the book is really kind of laying some of the foundation. So there is an underlying sense of logic and inference, and I wanted to kind of lay a little bit of groundwork. And that would be more a reference chapter if people say, well, what does this even mean here? And then the main part of the book is really getting into all constructs one by one by one, and each one with an example, and really giving the details of what the construct means. And my hat off to Dean Alamang and Jim in their first book. One of the biggest impressions that I came away with was the meaning of a construct in OWL is defined by the inferences that are sanctioned by that construct. So that's really the bottom line. You use this construct, and what inferences can you draw on that basis? So I've focused in my book around that principle. And then the third part was, so it's all nice to have all this stuff and to see how it's used in one case, but then I wanted to give a whole bunch of examples that are real examples that came right out of our corporate work. Say, well, here's how to address this kind of problem, and here's how to address this kind of problem, and these are the kind of things that arise over and over. That was my main motivation. I've been thinking about writing a book for a long time, and Ying Ding approached me a few years ago and said, Michael, have you ever been thinking about writing a book? And that kind of was the nudge that pushed me over the edge. But thank you.
And it's really one thing about all of these books that we're discussing today is that they're really well written and they're easy to get into. And Michael is very much the pragmatist on the OWL front, and he's talking primarily about the 20% of OWL that's really essential. And so I don't think any of this is rocket science, but people approach it as though it might be when they're unfamiliar with it, and when they search on the web for these standards or these concepts, they get overwhelmed with. They get down in the weeds too much to begin with. So thanks for the pragmatism. Heather, you also have been writing about data modeling, taxonomies, knowledge management, et cetera, and you're at SWC. Any comments about how to get modeling more at the forefront here and get people to understand its value?
Let me unmute here. Yeah, I've kind of transitioned from being just a taxonomist where we don't think of the models as much to, taxonomy than ontology, which takes more of a modeling approach. I'm not really sure if I can best answer that question, but I do want to say one thing tying in, with my book, which the Accidental Taxonomist was strictly taxonomies, and then I did just sign an agreement with a publisher to put out a third edition. Should come out a year from now, and I will then add something about ontologies and knowledge graphs and connecting it. Of course, I'm not the expert on that, and we have authors who've written about ontologies and knowledge graphs here. But just to make that connection, that where my background originally, I thought of taxonomies as control vocabularies for tagging content, and I wasn't really looking at the data side. And now I've seen that when you connect taxonomies to ontologies, which you can then also then you get to linking and modeling the data as well. So, and then connecting data and content. So I really want to, and that's great. I mean, that taxonomies are not then limited to the world of just content, like, unstructured content of texts and images, but getting into data in different kinds of databases. So I just want to thank you for showing that on my blog.
Yeah, she's. I'd forgotten that Heather had a book out, and thanks for updating us on that.
With me, but as I said, it's if you really want to get it, but it doesn't. I mean, it doesn't even mention knowledge graphs and barely mentions ontologies in the current edition, which came out in 2016. So it is due for an update. Yeah, I do write a blog, and I post every month on different taxonomy topics, and but in a different way than the book. And then I have discussed ontologies and knowledge graphs occasionally in the blog as well.
Yeah, and I think, Heather, one intriguing point about taxonomies versus ontologies and the vocabularies, et cetera, is that they're easier to get into to start with, and there's a learning curve. And SWC has this slide they use a lot, where you start by crawling, then you're walking a little bit, then you're running, and then you're flying. And I don't know anybody who's flying right now in terms of how they're managing their data and their knowledge. But you really have to dwell a lot on, with enterprises, you have to dwell a lot on, they're at level 1 and they need to be at level 5 or 3 or so, at least to take advantage of some of this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, when I first saw that slide and that taxonomies was only crawl, I was like, oh. But yeah, it's the way to start.
So thanks for that. Panos, you also have not too long ago published a book, and let me pull up that slide, that page as well. You want to tell us about your knowledge graph book? I think you're also a pragmatist.
Yes, I try to be, indeed. Yes, so let's say that contrary to Juan's and Ora's work, my work is mostly about the conceptual level. So what frustrated me and led me in writing this book was not so much about what technology to use and whether the data are represented in a graph model or in XML or something else. It was about what we put in the content of the ontologies and the taxonomies or whatever artifacts we build. In the years I have been working, I have noticed several, let's say, systematic errors that have been committed by not just practitioners, but also academics, and much advice that is out there in papers usually, or sometimes, and even in published ontologies and linked data that really pass the wrong message, so that some practices are good when in reality they're not. So that's why a big component of my book is what I call pitfalls, right? So there's a whole part, second part of the book that focuses on pitfalls, on things that are provenly wrong, at least based on actual experience, that things that won't work when it comes to, let's say, achieving the goal of semantic interoperability. Because a message I want to convey through this book is that semantic interoperability is not achieved just by using the right language, OL, RDF, or the semantic web stack, right? It's achieved by somehow managing to get people to agree on the meaning of things and the definition of things. And that is a very, very hard task. At the same time, as I have been working on an actual knowledge graph also in real situations, I came many times across difficult decisions. We had to decide whether to do one course of action or another, to take some modeling choices, and there wasn't always a clear decision, right? And the decision that and the choice that was more optimal for our company or for our clients was not necessarily for someone else's. So that's why I dedicated a part of the book called Dilemmas, and I tried to give some guidance on not to give an answer to the dilemma, but rather to guide the reader on how to solve the dilemma for their own case.
Yeah, and you're at text kernel currently, Panos?
Yes.
And one of the things I noted in your background was that there was an HR use case that you've worked on extensively. Is that correct?
Yes, because text kernel, operates in the HR domain. So we build software for matching CVs and jobs. But this is the application domain. In terms of, let's say, thematic domains, our professions and skills that we need to model cover, multiple domains like technology, economy. So in that sense, excuse me. In that sense, I cover a lot of domains. But another thing, a really telling thing that also gave a lot of focus in my book is that these domains had two characteristics. One, they contain a lot of abstract entities. So usually the knowledge graphs that we see talk about companies, about persons, about locations, about concrete entities. The real difficulty is when you try to define abstract entities like genres or like areas of knowledge, and also when you try to model non-Boolean knowledge that is vague, right? Relations and assertions that are not necessarily fully true or fully false, and that's something that I tried as much as possible to cover in my book.
Yeah, it's really a great observation, and one of the things I think about when I read books like Dave's, for example, is how many different levels of abstraction an enterprise actually has to deal with, and there's a lot of connecting the dots that just hasn't been done, and so people are still down in the concrete world rather than in the abstract world. So thanks for that, Panos. And we also have Bob Ducharme, who wrote Learning Sparkle, here with us, and And Bob, I don't know if you're available to just give us an overview of the query language space and what you hope to do with that book.
You're on mute.
We can hear you, I think.
I cannot hear him.
I'm not hearing.
Okay. You're still on mute then, Bob. I see the icon moving, but so maybe we'll go to Dave instead for now. Dave, you've got a couple of books many of us know about, and I think in addition to just giving us an overview, why don't you tell us what's happened since those books were published?
Sorry, Alan, I
Yeah.
just want to double check. Can you hear me now? This is Bob.
Yeah.
Hey, Bob.
Yes.
Why don't you go on ahead and give us some background
You
on?
sure I don't want to button line after I got?
No, it's good. I'm glad you got freed up there.
I had a mute button on my phone and I turned it off, but I forgot when the call started. A woman's voice said, "Press something something to unmute," and I was thinking, "Oh, I hope it was 6-9," and it turned out it was, because you can hear me. So, you know, if it's not a QWERTY keyboard, I don't know what to do with it to make it do what I want. So I wrote Learning Sparkle. It came out, the first edition was with 1.0, and then the second larger edition was with 1.1. One of my goals for the book was to have people writing and executing queries really within the first few pages. And some people actually, some pushback. They said, no, you should have covered the data model in more detail and what people are doing. And that is covered in chapter 2. But a lot more people really appreciated that the hands-on approach to like getting work done, you know, pulling data out of a triple store or whatever, even a file on disk, and manipulating it. So the book then covers, you know, the basics of querying, updating, how it gets used in some applications. I also write a monthly blog, which a lot of the times is me just playing with fun-looking open source tools that are related to Sparkle and RDF and reporting back on them. I have started lately. I never thought 2 or 3. I've been doing the blog a long time, and 3 or 4 years ago, I never thought I'd write a blog entry called "What is RDF?" But talking to a lot of people, especially who are new to knowledge, completely new to knowledge graphs, who are not coming from a particular knowledge graph related technology, I found a lot of people didn't really understand. So I wrote just a really simple introduction a few months ago on the blog that, and you're showing now, I followed that up with one called, you know, "What is RDFS?" So really going back to the basics there. Of course, when I wrote the book, the idea of knowledge graph was not, you know, a term that people were using a lot. I did, when I started looking into it myself, I wrote a blog entry about a history of the use of the term, and especially Juan's work there and his involvement on the dog stool conferences and things like that. So this, in some ways, you know, it's tempting to go, "Oh yeah, we've been doing that all along." But, you know, we've been doing I would say we've been using some of the technology that can be used to implement it for a long time. So that's kind of neat. And meanwhile, I keep playing with the tools and writing about them. And I recently, I don't think, you can see my last blog entry was about SCOS. I think it's my next one that I'm quoting Heather. Because of Heather, the distinction between taxonomies and ontologies is something I found a lot of people very, very blurry about. And like Heather says, the use of keywords to assign to content versus data modeling, I think is the great distinction. I'm going to write more about that in my next blog entry. I guess for now, I'm just sort of rambling. I don't know, Alan, if there's any particular issues you'd like me to address before I pass the baton.
Well, let's talk a bit about your background. You were at Top Quadrant for a number of years as an architect, I believe, and now you're at Commonwealth. What's the name of the company again?
CCRI is it's a technology company, research and some products in Charlottesville, Virginia. So there's not a whole lot of RDF related work going on here, but it's in the town I live in, so I could instead of working from home 90% of the time and traveling 10% of the time, as I had with my last few jobs before that. Here I go into an office, and mostly technical writing is what I'm doing here.
Yeah. And you're a great writer. If folks, if you haven't read Bob's blog or Learning Sparkle, it's another one of those resources that really helps you ground yourself in fundamentals that everybody needs to remind themselves of from time to time. So thanks for that, Bob. And
well, thank you.
Yeah, sure. And Dave, finally we're getting to you and your two books. And tell us about what's been happening with Software Wasteland. I know it's been a popular book. And what your clients are saying about it, or prospective clients.
Yeah, and actually, there's 3 books. I did write one almost 20 years ago called Semantics in Business Systems, or something like that, which is just making the case for why you should think semantically about the concept. And that kind of didn't go anywhere and didn't make any ripples, and it just kind of, I mean, it was true, but so what? And to your point, Software Wasteland was mostly to try and get people angry enough to change. Just to say there's something deeply flawed with the way we've been doing this now for the last 30 or 40 years. And you first have to come to grips with that before, you can try and get better. So that's what that was. And then the data-centric revolution, I didn't want it. Well, at first it was just going to be one book. And somebody convinced me that it might be better to separate. Here's the one book is the problem, and just go dwell in it for a while. And the other one is kind of the solution. And if you just have the solution without the problem, maybe people aren't motivated enough to move. I don't know. The second book ended up being a trilogy, and then ended up not being a trilogy. It was supposed to be, the data-centric revolution was going to kind of outline for management and sponsors. Here's what you need to know to get moving. Then there's going to be the data-centric pattern language. I identified about 140 patterns, so similar to Panos and some of those. I tried them out in a few presentations. I wrote part of the book. It wasn't doing anything for me. Somebody convinced me to do a podcast, and I've now proven that I don't have a lot of discipline to do a podcast, but maybe. I've got 6 episodes in the can. I suppose if I get a few more episodes, I can stay ahead of it, that there will be a podcast. And then the third book was going to be the data-centric architecture, but that morphed into a conference. So we have our data-centric architecture forum now. So it's kind of in fact, I think it makes more sense to be a forum than a book, because there's, a lot of people participating, and it keeps changing. And so, if you wrote a book, it would be stale as soon as you wrote it. So, and then meanwhile, I got another one in progress now that I'm kind of excited about. It's called Data-Centric Accounting. It's kind of the same idea, except in the world of accounting, I mean, we've barely moved forward since Patchouli in the year 1600 or something, whoever invented double entry bookkeeping. We've added a little bit, but really it's pretty, the state of the art of accounting is kind of horrible, frankly. So I got together with an accounting professor. We're writing a book to say, if you really stared at this really hard semantically, all the complexity, which sort of, as Aura was suggesting, it just sort of drops away. It's kind of fascinating. It's a beautiful thing to observe. So, and how are people responding to it? I mean, some people are responding to it, but let's be real. It's our industry is still 0.5% of the whole. I mean, we have a huge way to go to move some people to think this way. And love having all the fellow travelers here, but man, we need a lot more.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, and gives us a segue into what the rest of the attendees think about the problems that we're trying to solve with the books, and how to raise awareness about the community. And Molham, I know you have a big picture view of this, and we have a tendency to be rather insular. It's hard to to get out in the world enough to really expand our horizons and evangelize enough. But maybe you could give us some pointers then. You there, Moham? Or did he go? Or how about Tim Smith? Tim, are you on?
Yeah, Mullen left, but Tim's still here, but you're on mute if you're trying to talk, Tim.
I just want to say
Yes,
that
I'm still here.
The Software Wasteland, I think, is mandatory reading for any data professional. And I tell this to everybody. Like, I think I bought 15 versions of your book that just personally give it to like new hires and like, please read this book, because if you don't, you need to understand the problem, especially the younger generation, because they go off and they think, oh, the latest, coolest data technology is going to go solve, and then they're going to go work with customers, and they're like, oh, you got these big monolithics, and like, well, this is different from all the cool technologies. Like, well, yeah, because the real world is really hard. Go read this book to understand why it's so hard and why it all sucks. So thank you, Dave, for really writing that book. It's mandatory reading.
Thank you. Thank you.
The messages like that are really helpful. So Juan, what do you think we ought to do to get more people to recognize what's going on here? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I thought you had it to Tim. I want to talk to Tim.
Tim, are you available?
Yeah, I just had to switch my speakers around so it wouldn't echo.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm catching you at work. I apologize. So any thoughts about how to get enterprises more on board with what we're trying to do and why it's important, and sort of spreading the message better? You're at P&G, for those that don't know you, but go ahead.
Yes.
Did we lose you?
We got one syllable out of you there, Tim, before you went mute again.
I'm not sure how that happened, but here I am.
Okay.
So yeah, I've been kind of working in this space and trying to evangelize semantic technology in general since the late 90s in our pharmaceutical division, and kind of bantered this around for many years. I think people are starting to see the promise to it, and what I've been doing lately is starting to speak in terms of machine computable knowledge representations. We have a burgeoning systems engineering practice. We've actually been doing that for about 10 years, and it's finally getting some traction where we boiled SysML down to actually just the core components that we need. And people are starting to understand that that's pretty interesting. Those practitioners, which I am one, but not as experienced as many of our others folks, they don't quite understand why you need a full ontology behind it, because it's a great human consumable version of knowledge capture and reuse. But so for example, if you want to flow information about the process that a line operator is running when on the manufacturing line in real time, because some sensor triggered an out of boundary conditions, and you need to surface part of your knowledge from your knowledge graph to that individual, you better have a machine computable version of that knowledge that can work. So even though we're storing the knowledge in effect in triples, we're not actually using triple stores, which is unfortunate, but we're storing it in a graph kind of way. It's still not tractable. So what I've been arguing for, because this plays into the push into machine learning and that sorts of, Industry 4.0, all of that, you can kind of wrap this up and go, well, why wouldn't we want to have machine computable knowledge graphs available, and what does that mean? And so I'm actually making also some progress with our enterprise architecture team, where I've shown them how I can take build an ontology of relational tables and say, hey, here's the ontology. This represents the business concepts there. And oh, by the way, if I use tools other than Irwin or those kinds of tools, I can make an ontology look like an Irwin diagram, which thrills the heck out of them because that's the only diagram they recognize. But I'm actually getting some traction now by saying, look, I can generate these models, I can compute against these models, I can use these models in different types of systems. We're doing a prototype with Timber.ai because it lessens the threshold, so nobody has to go off and learn Sparkle. They can stay in their SQL-like environment and write SQL-like queries, but by traversing a virtual graph. So that has a lot of interesting implications for people that are not hardcore data engineers or data scientist types. And we have many of those. We have very few of the former. So I think there's a lot of little pockets where knowledge graphs really are going to come into play. And the key to doing it is it can't be another piece of shiny technology. It has to be wrapped up in some other business process or business initiative. So I'm looking at how do I tie the use of a knowledge graph to the execution of product development, right? So we call it, we have initiatives, and how do I tie that into the phases of the initiative so that the graph is being produced and consumed and populated as matter of course in the daily business. And then you start getting into tools. I can't go to a top-rate composer or a protege or any of the tools like that because nobody cares. I need them to be interacting with the knowledge graph inside of Teams, for example, or the Office 365 environment, which is where a lot of our stuff lives today. And we're still kind of figuring out what does that mean? Like, how do I make a semantic meeting happen? What does that mean? And I wrote a paper 10 years ago for internal use that kind of described that environment, and we've made no progress towards that environment, and neither has any vendor either. It's pretty sad, actually. So anyway.
Those are some really good thoughts, Tim, and I appreciate your sharing them. And I think it triggers some thoughts in terms of, getting more of this technology under the covers and into a familiar frame so folks can work with it and not exposing them so much to the nuts and bolts of how things work. And that sort of points to a lack of funding for our space, because we may not be communicating what is a very difficult message to the investment community. And so I'm going to open for 15 minutes or so, I'm going to open the discussion up to the rest of the folks in the room here, wondering if you had any thoughts or comments about what we've been talking about or other things you'd like to discuss. Feel free just to unmute and talk away. We're going to have to wait a while, Dave, to get others unplugged here, I guess. Any other comments or observations based on what you've been listening to, folks who?
So I maybe have a question. I wonder if the authors could comment on what point do you want to put something into a book rather than putting it in blogs and web posts and so on, because the blogs and web posts seem to be where the most recent stuff goes, but it needs to have a certain solidity before you put it in a book. It would be my thought, and I wonder what the authors think about that.
Well, I'll go first because I kind of went in the opposite direction. I thought I was going to write a couple of books, and they went out into hopefully more real time. Yeah, although at this point I'm kind of embarrassed I haven't kept up with my podcast. But I think you're right. I think it can evolve online a bit, and then maybe it will gel. Maybe there is a book at the end of this. I don't know. But and the same actually with the architecture. It was too soon to write it down. I think we have to figure it out and evolve it.
In my case, the book was probably the result of 5-6 years. I mean, there's actually I bring in material from a paper in 2011, I think. So it's almost 10 years of stuff in there. So we'll make an open web version of the book, so for free. I think probably next year we just got to turn everything into HTML, and I want every single mapping pattern, for example, to have its own page, and I can send the URL to somebody like, okay, you're trying to go do this thing, so go look at this particular snippet, and there it is. The other thing is, I'm preparing another book on a different topic, and I'm doing it starting from the podcast. So we have, I don't know, 60 episodes of a podcast over a year and a half. So I got plenty of material for a couple of books there. So that's my next tactic.
I also look at this in different way. So sometimes you have to wait until you have some kind of, shall we now call it, critical mass that you can put in book. But on the other hand, sometimes you need to kind of get ahead of things. You need to poke people a little bit and get them kind of thinking about this stuff. And, maybe it's not a book. My experience was with the early days of semantic web, that writing the article for Science American 20 years ago, when the semantic web was incredibly immature concept, was really, really necessary because it kind of got people excited, and a lot of activity resulted from publishing that. And there was good and bad. I think we were accused of being science fiction authors when that all came out. So but the bottom line is that a lot of people got excited, and a lot of people started thinking about this, and that was a good thing.
Yeah.
I thought I had a.
Go ahead.
Oh, thanks. This is Bob. I thought I had a fairly simple answer to this question, but after hearing Aura's answer, it made mine more complicated. Between my learning Sparkle, and I've written books on XSLT and XML several years ago, and in all those cases, what to cover is kind of simple because it's the most, these are W3 specs, so the latest version of the spec. The main judgment call is what's the important parts that people need to get up and running with this. And then you want to at least describe, the other stuff that we're not going into detail. But after hearing what Aura just said, I realized that part of it also with these books is describing not just how to do this stuff, but why doing this stuff is worthwhile. Why taking advantage of this technology is going to help you get work done, current work and future work. And so thinking about how it all relates to current applications and future applications is the thing to think about. But ultimately, the fact that what's in the spec, that sort of delimits what goes in the book, and that's why I have the blog. Like, oh, people, RDS star or Sparkle star is this new thing that might be in there. I played with it. Hey, it was kind of fun. Here's what I did. That's the kind of thing I'm more likely to do in the blog. If there is an update to the book, an RDS star and Sparkle star. If there is an update to the recommendation, an RDS star and Sparkle star are in there, I'll certainly cover it then.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, I started my blog after I wrote the book, but my book, The Accidental Taxonomist, actually came out of an online course that I had created. And I think for many of us, our books have a certain tutorial aspect of it. We give workshops at conferences or other workshops, so there's more of a teaching aspect where blogs don't try to teach so much as just to raise awareness about different topics. And I still run my online course, and there's this synergy going back and forth to update each other.
There's a related thing here about standardization. Oftentimes, standardization happens when things have matured to a point where the industry can come together and agree on certain things. And when we worked on the early semantic web standards like RDF, people said you're standardizing too early. There's no consensus here. This stuff is not mature. Why are you standardizing? And my response to that actually it's one of those things that happen because the whole field of doing ontologies and sharing ontologies was incredibly immature, and people weren't able to do that. And so we had to put some pieces in place so that people actually come together and start building things. The semantic web and those ontologies, that's a team sport. You can't play alone. So it only makes when a lot of people are playing. So So that's kind of like the other side of standardization. I think that in terms of publishing, whether that's an article or book, same thing. Sometimes you have to be early. Sometimes you have to wait until there is maturity.
Yeah, and I think it's Aura, thanks for that observation. And so it begs the question, where are we going with the standards now? Because there's been maturity for sure, and those of us who are familiar with all the standards appreciate and can see the benefits of that maturity, but others don't seem to be receptive to it. Way I think about it is that, you know, we've got this fractional adoption. How do we increase adoption by evolving the standards?
The nature of standardization, I think, changed over the past 20 years a lot. If I look at what was going on in the late 1990s, standardization was still understood to be something where that sort of way something had to a point we could start thinking about a bigger market. And now industry comes together and sort of in a sort of good faith effort, let's say, wants to put something in place so that we can build this bigger market. And I think that over the last 20 years, standardization in many ways has changed to be more political. In ways like, what can we be a standard that mainly hurts our competitors and things. My former boss, Professor Juhani Kuusi, from head of Nokia Research, always used to say that standardization should be like baking a cake. That you want to make the cake as big as you can, and that's the role of standardization. Then after that, competition is what determines how big of a slice you get out of that cake.
Mm.
Yeah, it's a nice metaphor. Michael, you raised your hand about this. You have a comment?
Yeah, it was about the question of when to write a book that Chris put up there.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed you.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. No, it's a great question. I think that the answer is variable depending on who you are and what the circumstances are. There really is no one right answer. In my case, I'd been thinking about doing a book for many years, having worked in academia and industry. But honestly, I never got around to it, and I'm kind of lazy, to be honest. And then one day I decided to give a tutorial at one of the ISWIC conferences. And that kind of got me excited. I just decided I'm going to start from scratch and do this kind of circular model of introducing things just bit by bit, as I described earlier. And then I had this beautiful set of material, which I turned into a tutorial and gave slides. And then I thought to myself, this could totally be the first part of a book. And that's kind of how it evolved for me. And then Ying Ding came up to me and said, hey, have you thought about writing a book? And it was like that. In that moment, I realized I could totally turn this first 2 chapters into a book and just follow up with the rest of it. So that's how it evolved in my case. I write the odd blog or two, but really not enough coherent material to pull into a book. But that's kind of what it worked like for me.
And in Michael's case, you're sort of anchoring the whole topic, just as, for example, Bob is. You're the guru now on the OWL front, because you've written a book about it, and Bob's written the book on Sparkle, for example. And so there's a lot of material there that just needs to be rediscoverable in some ways. And what I would say in light of the blogs and the books and the social media is that we sort of have to take a tiered approach to the content so that we're distributing as well as publishing, because publishing just isn't enough. You just can't reach enough people in today's online environment just with publishing. They won't find what you're really trying to, the messages you're trying to impart and the angle that you're taking. So that's why I've always, when I was in publishing at PwC, I've always coupled the social media with the longer content, so that there is a distribution of sorts that goes beyond just posting it initially and hoping the press will pick up on it.
Yeah. One just final comment. It has been gratifying. I talked to the publisher, Morgan Crakel, and they have told me that the book is one of the better sellers in this kind of subgrouping. So I was really happy to hear that. So it's getting some reasonable exposure.
Well, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. And so we've got a couple of minutes left, folks. If you have any closing comments or other observations you'd like to make, this has been a really good discussion. And authors, thanks to you all for taking the time to join us and sharing your thoughts, which are really interesting.
Yeah, Alan, I mean, thanks for pulling this together. What a great idea.
Yeah, it was really nice. I learned a lot from the other authors too.
Well, yeah, it's something that hadn't occurred to me before, so maybe we'll do it another time as well. There's like 20 books that we haven't talked about yet that are worth talking about too.
Yeah.
So we're on the half hour. Might as well sign off, given that we seem to be at a good stopping point. We'll look forward to next month, where we're hoping to have Lead Semantics present. They are working with Flurry, and they had a really interesting demo that I saw a while back. So hopefully you all can join us for that demo, and we'll try to tee up some other interesting things in future months then.